This session will be the first of 3 videos exploring the world of interpretation through exegesis. In this first video, we'll try to elucidate the meaning of exegesis. What does it mean to do exegesis of a text? Because there is a lot of noise around that term. As we will see, exegesis is sometimes narrowed down to pure textualism and literal interpretation. And this is not true. Well, we'll try to find out what the reality is. The word is actually coming from biblical studies. You do the exegesis of the Bible. The word comes actually, it's a Greek word that means to explain, but also to lead. And the root of the Greek word comes from the Indo-European languages, and it means to have flair, a little bit of this talent that hunters or warriors were needing when on the ground. Exegesis was later extended to other texts. It first applied to the Bible, trying to make sense of the Bible. It's the Word of God. What does it mean? Putting it in context. And you can do exegesis of other relevant texts, including legal text. And not surprisingly, since the Corpus Juris Civilis has been called the other Bible of the Western world, it's been compared to the Bible. That's the title of a book by Pierre Legendre. Exegesis started quite early with the Roman law, the moment the Roman law got compiled in the Corpus Juris Civilis. And you may say that the work of the glossators, the commentators, was doing the exegesis of the Roman law scriptures. It refers to interpretation, commentary, or a detailed development or detailed speech about a text. So it is a big mistake to reduce exegesis to pure grammatical or literal interpretation of the text as if you only had the text. When you do exegesis, you open the study and the field of investigation to all kinds of context and other texts, as we will see in this video. So, of course, the object of interpretation or the object of exegesis is a text. The text is to be viewed as the object, right? It must be analyzed in its wording, in its syntax, in its grammar. There is no doubt about this. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with the text and only with context. Of course, the wording of the text matters a great deal. But the meaning of a text cannot be reduced to the letter. And let's take an easy example. Imagine that I tell you, I invite you to share my meal. It sounds clear enough. I believe that every one of you will have a clear understanding of what I mean there. But if I look at it literally, textually, share my meal, share means to partition my meal, to divide it into portions. It does not necessarily indicate, the word itself, that you have to eat it. So you may come and help me do portions out of my meal and then maybe go home. Is that the meaning? Is that what is meant? If you rely on the letter alone, you don't get the full sense. Now, should I write, I invite you to eat a meal that I will serve and also share my company and conversation. And why not in my invitation also say, there will be drinks and utensils so that you can bring the food or the drinks to your mouth, that I have to provide a napkin, etc., and so forth and so on. You never do this in a social life. And why would we be expecting to do this with the law? Language is never 100% explicit. Much of the message is implied. I invite you to share my meal implies all these things that I've articulated and maybe a few more. I have reflected on this in a recent articles, The Words of Comparative Law. I'll send it to you if you like to read it. Now, you'll hear a lot discussing interpretation and exegesis about the letter and the spirit of the law. And this language may sound a little bit mysterious. Exegesis is the search of intent of those who wrote the text. In the Bible, you search for the divine intent. It's the word of God. You try to understand the message that God is giving up to us, human beings. In a code, in a legislative code or in an act, you search for the legislative intent. What did the legislators want to achieve and tell us to do or not to do in that text? So you see, whether you look at the Bible or the civil code, you are in search of intent. And by essence, this goes beyond the words. It never meant pure literal interpretation or pure textualism, as some want you to believe. Exegetes consider the text and the context. Context means what comes along with the text, what is around the text. The text gives the letter, and the context gives you the spirit. You look for the spirit of the text to make sense of the letter. That's what exegesis is. And look, since I was mentioning the Bible, look at what St. Paul in the second letter to the Corinthians say, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. He is actually pointing to some people, maybe the Pharisees, who will concentrate on the letter and forget the spirit or the intent behind it. And we all know that in religion, these people, name them fundamentalist or radical religious people, going simply by the letter doesn't bring good things. It can bring bad things if it is not inspired by the project, by the intent, and by the spirit. And it's much like this with the law. Yeah, here you have a visual of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. This is just a little pause on the way. Never forget to smile or laugh about things, even the most serious ones. And now, what is it that they say the common law world when they are discussing interpretation? It's something completely different. You have here excerpts of the Interpretation Act 1978, which is the British statute regarding interpretation of statutes. You have section 6 that cares of gender and number. Read it for yourself. In any act, unless the contrary intention appears, words importing the masculine gender include the feminine. Words importing the feminine gender include the masculine. Well, that's very trendy, I would say. People in gender studies would approve this. And C, words in the singular include the plural, and words in the plural include the singular. When a civilian reads this, they say, what? Do you need a statute to tell me this? Do you need to tell me that he can be understood as a he or she or they? I mean, we know this by instinct, looking at language. How come you're putting that in a statute? The problem is that people out there tell you, oh, exegesis is just about that, grammatical interpretation. And this, interestingly, has percolated into Louisiana statutes. If you look not at the civil code, but at the revised statutes, you have provisions that mirror the English Interpretation Act, telling you that singular may denote plural, that one gender may denote others. You have provisions about conjunctive and disjunctive. Anyone who has been in primary school knows these things. It's extraordinary that you would put it in the law. And even find it in a civil code. Look at this provision in Louisiana, 1493D. It's saying that forced heirship, you may benefit from this if you are 20, up to age 23. And for the purpose of this article, says the code, a person is 23 years of age or younger until he attains the age of 24 years. I mean, it is extraordinary that you would have this in a civil code. But that speaks that Louisiana is, of course, in contact with common law culture. And but the point that I want to make is that such provisions are completely useless in a civil law context. A 4-year-old knows these things. Why put it in the law? It looks in a way like an insult to intelligence, but things always have a reason. There are historical reasons which why these provisions have been needed, and you'll understand that better once we explore the common law world. It has been put there as a safeguard against a tendency to interpret statutes in a literal manner, which is an attitude that prevailed in the English judiciary in the 19th century England. And that's where I guess this idea that exegesis is pure textualism is coming from. Civilians do not need this sort of warning. They have known at all times that interpretation of the law is never purely literal. It is a search of meaning. Exegesis, I insist, never meant literal interpretation. I have to put a warning here, okay? This does not mean that you can ignore the letter and move immediately from the text of the code into the context. You must, of course, read legal provisions with the utmost care and weigh every word in it. Read carefully, then think in search for other sources, and then read again carefully. Think and search again. It's like breathing exercise, okay? Good jurists are doing this. You never forget or ignore the text. Always keep your attention to the wording, but there is much else beside, hence the need of 3 videos to tell you what exegesis is. So back to it. We start with the text. What you have is the letter of the text. That is the starting point. Then you try to elaborate about the context. You have to do some thinking and use logic and do some research to identify the spirit of the text. You may have to look into legal history, legislative history, to use your brain and tools of logic that will be explained in the next video. The outcome of this is the discovery of the legislative intent, making sense of words that tell you much but don't tell you everything, like my invitation to share a meal. So when the text is needing interpretation, which is of course the case when the language is obscure, or when the text is using general words, generality of terms, or sometimes when the text is silent, gaps or lacunae that we discussed earlier, you will consider first the legislative history. You will look at the preparatory works, a doctrinal work, historical precedent that inspired the legislators. You will look at doctrinal and jurisprudential interpretation of that text. And it's a big part that we have already discussed in the previous module. You'll have to use some logical processes that will be explored in the next video. And you will also remember maxims of interpretation that are guiding you along the way. And I would say that exegesis is the combination of all of the above. It's not picking one or two in this methodology, but it's combining all these tools. Now, to conclude, why is it that exegesis has been downplayed? I think I gave part of the answer. but I have also to focus on some criticism of exegesis that came from within the legal tradition. The exegesis of old texts, indeed, when the text is very old, may look artificial when new problems that could not have been anticipated by the legislators come up. It's very difficult then to make this adjustment, and you have to second guess. And that is a criticism. But they say, maybe it's not the way to go with these very old texts that have been done before the industrial age and the digital revolution. So modernists have a tendency, in order to promote new and more suitable methods of interpretation, in this case, they say, oh, you know, let's move away from textualism. That is not right, because as I have explained, that as we will see, exegesis is a lot more than textualism. And also, I want to say about this criticism that nowadays laws are frequently updated. And it's a fair guess to say that more than 95% of interpretation that is done in the courts nowadays is exegetical in nature. You rarely have to rely on very old provisions written 200 years ago. I have already alluded to the criticism that comes from outside the civil law tradition. Common law scholars, may be misguided by progressive civilians, view exegesis as literal interpretation, which it is not. So all this is sort of polluting the view, the vision, or the perception that you may have of exegesis. To conclude this first video, most civil law interpretation is, and I insist, exegetical. Modern methods are rarely applied, and yes, they conflict with exegesis, and then you have conflicting arguments with one party using a school of thought and the other one more modern methods. But you understand now the reason why a good civilian, worth her salt, must be familiar with the exegetical method. And I will leave things here. I will meet you in the next video.